Book 4, Part 3. Might as well take me to my room, I huffed, and he leaned over and pushed the 4 on the panel. At least there might be a bathroom I can hide out in, I mumbled. One nice thing about bodyguards, they didn't talk when you didn't want them to. So they stood, like two massive pillars, while the elevators whirred upward. The ding came, the door slid open, and we stepped out. This time, Michael took the lead, with Martin staying behind him. Again, I barely noticed my surroundings until we turned down another hall, and something tickled my nose. I sneezed, and Michael stopped and looked at me. Vampires didn't sneeze, but I did a lot of things most vampires didn't, like shift into a werewolf. I wrinkled my nose and then sneezed again. He watched me carefully. I shook my head and then shrugged. He frowned, but turned and continued down the hall, although I saw him tap that thing in his ear and talk so low I would have to focus to hear him, which I didn't try to do. Miss Mullender stepped out of a set of doors and turned, smiling at us. Maybe that's what bothered me. She really wasn't that much older than me, and yet I had to call her Miss. Nope, that wasn't it either. Then Jonathan stepped out of the same room, laughing. Wow, my hackles shot straight up, and my fists clenched. Martin moved up next to me, and Michael stepped partially in front of me as she approached. That annoying smile plastered on that freakishly pretty face. Back so soon? She almost sang, this time with one of those notebook computer things in her arm. I had to lean a bit to see her, and she blinked up at my bodyguard. Okay, that made me smile a bit. Walls did come in handy from time to time. Just taking her to her room, Michael stated, and actually stepped in front of her when she tried to move around him to get closer to me. She actually balked, and I bit the side of my cheek to keep my smile in check. Somehow, he knew I didn't like her. He didn't ask why. If I didn't like her, she would be kept at a distance, plain and simple. I suddenly wanted to wrap my arms around what I could of his huge back and give him a hug. He was awesome. Well, her room is all ready, she stated, but I could tell she wasn't used to this kind of treatment. Seems her pretty face got her through more keyholes than most. Hate to break it to you, I thought, but it won't get you past Michael. I'll show it to her, Jonathan stated, and I leaned a bit more around Michael to see him. He was standing almost shoulder to shoulder with her, and I felt the growl start deep inside me. My fist tightened more, and then I heard someone running down the hall. I had to lean to the other side and smiled as Phil trotted up, a worried look on his face. I stepped around Michael and up to my wolf. His eyes searched mine, and then he looked over. His brows lifted, and he looked back at me. There went that guilt again. Man, if I got paid for every... I sighed, but he smiled. Wait until you see your shower. That did get my attention, and I followed him down the hall. Okay, so it was kind of rude that we didn't say goodbye to Jonathan or her, and that Jonathan had said he was going to show me my room, but, well, too bad. I huffed mentally and stepped into the room that made me smile. It was large, a bit larger than my own, actually. To the left there was a good-sized sitting area with a big plush couch, a few small tables, and a large screen TV mounted on the wall. The furniture was soft burgundy with creams and blue accents. The floor was tiled but had large plush throw rugs to match. The bed, I sighed, was a king-size bed with mounds of pillows piled up on it. It was a 4-poster bed with thick burgundy curtains tied back, and I fought the urge to run and jump on it. How long had it been since I slept in something so nice? Since home, I thought. Phil chuckled, and I wondered if I thought that with the part he could hear. He winked and pulled me past the dresser, the walk-in closet, and up to a set of double doors with frosted glass and fancy handles. "Can I get a drum roll, please?" he said, and I bounced on my toes as he shrugged and opened both doors, pulling them outward towards us. I gasped as he took my hand again and pulled me inside. The floor was blue marble, and the swirls made it look almost like water. The sink was raised, and various creams made it look like the inside of an oyster. The enormous tub sat on a pedestal and was swirled with nearly every color with brown background to soften it. 2 steps higher than the rest of the floor, it seemed like a stage or a monument. I tilted my head, trying to think of how to describe it, even to myself. There were large potted plants placed out of their way, but their leaves softened everything and made you inhale and then breathe out the stress that you brought in with you. Phil turned to me, and I smiled, seeing the entrance to a walk-in shower that was tiled in various shades of green, with some of the tiles actually shaped like leaves. I put my hand against the wall and then leaned forward. There was no curtain or door, because the entrance turned a bit and the actual shower was to the right. I stepped in, shoes and all, and gawked. One large shower head, the size of a dinner plate, hung from the top. There were bronze-colored pipes along the walls with smaller heads offering a multitude of options for its guest. The built-in seat was actually contoured with a smaller footrest along the wall. "Amazing," I whispered, and Phil nodded. "To start with." "Huh?" "I mean, you can start with amazing." "Oh," I smiled and touched the piping, seeing the small levers that allowed you to turn them on or off. The rack that held the shampoo, soap, and cloths was also built into the wall, but had a frosted sliding cover over it. "I'm going to sleep right here," I smiled, and he laughed behind me. Did he think I was kidding? "How about you start with a nice long shower, and then we'll go from there," Phil teased. Okay, I could compromise. When he finally dragged me out of the bathroom, it was only because he said I would need to get my things before I went back in. I was so going back in there. Back in the room, I frowned when I saw a maid at the dresser, and another with thick plush towels in her arms. The towels were fine, but what was the other one doing? She turned and curtsied. "Will the miss be in need of sleepwear or house clothes?" My brows nearly jumped off my forehead, and Michael chuckled behind me. I knew they were more formal here, but seriously? Even our house help at Wellsgrove wasn't this bad. "How about I pick out her clothes?" Phil stated, and I could only blink when she bowed and skirted off to help the others. When he started to pull open a top drawer, I jumped, rushed over, and slammed it shut. I didn't know what was in those dressers, but everyone knew what was always in the top one. "Something wrong?" "Never open the top drawer to a girl's dresser," I whispered, and he frowned. "It's a female's dresser. You just don't—" I sighed when he kept staring. Then I leaned over and whispered into his ear. "Ah, sorry, didn't know that," he smiled, shaking his head. "So, jeans or PJ bottoms?" he asked, pulling open the second one slowly to see if I would slam it too. I looked down and saw a half-dozen pair of new jeans neatly folded. That was just a bit freaky. He shrugged, closed it, and opened the next drawer, then pulled out a pair of deep green pajama bottoms with a drawstring at the waist. "Now these look comfy and—" he looked around. They would go perfect with that gray t-shirt, if we can find it. If she's missing anything, it can be ordered. We turned, and the smile slipped from Phil's face as Jonathan walked in. Then it slipped from mine as my dad's pretty little assistant followed. She lifted her little computer thing and nodded. Absolutely, she chirped. Now what is it that she needs? I moved my leg closer to Phil, letting it touch his. He stood up straighter and smiled. Actually, you can't order everything. Oh, you'd be surprised, Mr. Astor, she smiled, winking at him. I swallowed hard then, too dumbfounded to speak. Was she for real? Then I felt his arm around my waist. Sorry to disappoint you and your little book there, but we were actually looking for her favorite t-shirt. It's gray, way too big, and smells like wolf. I had to clench my fist to keep from slapping it over my mouth. She can't sleep without it anymore, he added with a smile in his voice. I bit my lower lip and looked down. No idea at all how to respond. I felt Jonathan's eyes, and I did what anyone else in my situation would do. I snatched the pajama bottoms out of Phil's hand and ran into the bathroom. Chapter 4. I couldn't tell what was being said out there, but I gasped when the door opened and Phil stepped inside and shut it behind him. I was leaning against the counter, the pajamas clutched to my chest. When he frowned, I rushed up to him and wrapped my arms around his waist and put my cheek against his chest. He stiffened at first, then held me. I inhaled him slowly as I listened to his heartbeat. As it slowed and calmed, I felt myself level off too. I'm sorry, I whispered. He chuckled. What are you sorry for? I looked up at him. I didn't know why I did that. It was so stupid. He shook his head and kissed me. She gets your hackles up, and Jonathan is playing that like a fiddle. You still have guilt about him, and he's playing on that too. Really? Yes. So I went a little too far and ran you in here. I'm the one that's sorry. I hugged him tighter and smiled. He was awesome. If she says absolutely one more time... He laughed and stroked my hair. I do love you, Tay. Is this where the party is? We turned as Track and Jackson walked in. Phil kept me in his arms as we saw Michael, Jonathan, and that lady still standing in the room. Jonathan's eyes locked on mine and then lifted to the ones above me. Jackson moaned and shut the door. Man, who knew that vampires musked, he chuckled, then whistled as he looked around. Now this is what I call a bathroom. He started to inspect the room and Track shook his head. So, anyhow, nice place. That blonde chick is smoking hot, too, Jackson stated as he stepped into the shower. I huffed, and he poked his head out. Don't tell me we don't like her. The look on my face made him sigh, and he pointed at me hard. Fine, but you owe me a hot chick. Then he disappeared back inside. Track smiled and shook his head, then looked at me, his eyes asking if I was okay. Wow. Maybe that mysterious eye thing wasn't just for the guys after all. I winked at him and hugged Phil, then stood up a bit. Okay, guys, thank you and all, but I really want to get in that shower. Come on in, Jackson shouted, and I giggled. Phil looked down at my hand. You're going to need more than that. I glanced at the pajama bottoms and wrinkled my nose playfully. Jackson, who had stepped back out, opened his mouth and then shook his head. Yeah, even I know better than that. When I looked back at the door, Track sighed heavily. Fine. The best friend will go get the rest of your stuff. When I shook my head, he shrugged. It'll be worth it to see their faces when I open your top drawer. With that, he walked to the door, opened it, and closed it quickly behind him. How does he know about the top drawer? Phil asked, amazed. Jackson shook his head. Come on, Phil. Everyone knows about a female's top drawer. He looked at me and winked. That's where all the good stuff is. I moaned and Phil turned to me. Seems I'm the only one that didn't know that. I giggled and he nodded. I'll go see if that shirt is around here somewhere. What if... His jaw twitched. If they did, I have others. He put his hand on the doorknob and then turned. Out, Jay. Jackson moaned theatrically, planted a quick kiss on my cheek when the door opened, and then trotted out. I saw the look on her face as Phil shut the door. It was a cross between shock and disgust. I growled at the door and slammed the pajamas on the counter. She had some nerve. That shower was beyond amazing, though. The top head rained the warm water down on me, and the side ones gently relaxed the stress away. I lifted my head and let it consume me. At some point, I thought about Aaron and Marcus, and my tears mixed with the water. Finally, I grabbed the shampoo and washed myself, feeling the weight of all my pain and guilt ease just a bit as the steam and water engulfed me. When I finally turned off the main valve, I still stood there, warmed by the air. I didn't want to step out. Reality was out there, and I almost reached for the handle to turn it back on so I could hide a little longer. But a sound stopped me cold. Hello? I called out, covering myself with my hands and listening. I mumbled about being so jumpy, and then I heard another sound. Who's there? Then I sneezed. Something tickled my nose, and I wiggled it and sneezed again. I slowly moved to the bend in the wall and peeked around it. Is someone out there? Another sneeze. I frowned and stepped up to the edge of the shower floor and looked out, then turned my head the other way and frowned. I was alone. I snatched the towel off the rack and quickly wrapped it around me and stepped onto the plush rug, frowning. Had that been there before? Using another towel, I started to dry my hair, then smiled and relaxed a bit when I saw my clothes on the counter. Track had brought me regular underclothes, thankfully. Then I lifted the blue t-shirt and held it to my nose, smiling as Phil's scent filled me. Relaxed once again, I took my time drying myself, my hair, and even getting dressed. It felt good to be clean. I noticed a hamper in the corner and tilted my head. Had that always been there? Shrugging to myself, I dropped my clothes in it, opened the door, and stepped out. Phil stood up from the bed, and I smiled, pointing behind me. You have got to try that shower. You'll have to show me how it works, he grinned, taking me into his arms and kissing me. I blinked up at him when he pulled back, and he smiled. I told you what it does to me when you wear my shirts. I giggled, pulling on the hem that was midway down my thigh. So, what's your room like? It's nice, and I'm sharing it with Ryan, he said flatly. Not enough rooms? I'm pretty sure there are plenty of rooms. It's to keep me from doing anything stupid, he chuckled, and then looked down at my hand. Oops, I forgot about the splint. He took my good hand and walked me to the couch. We can worry about that in a minute. I smiled and sat down next to him. Check this out, he whispered, and picked up a remote. He pushed a button, and instead of the TV blinking on, a fire burst to life under it. I gasped and leaned forward a bit. I hadn't even noticed the fireplace there. The wall was indented a bit, but the screen was the same color as the wall. It slid back quietly but silently to reveal the gas fireplace. Phil pulled me back and wrapped his arms around me. So, here we are, just the two of us, on vacation in Europe. I smiled and nodded, snuggling closer to him. Tomorrow we should go see Big Ben. I like this game. Or Westminster Abbey. No abbey, he chuckled, kissing my cheek. I'm not getting you anywhere near an abbey. When I laughed, he shrugged. Then again, it is a church, and he stopped when my eyes popped. Scared of a church? When I didn't react, he shook his head. You know that sooner or later... You're ruining the game, I whispered, softening my eyes and my voice. His brows rose as I turned and tucked my legs under me, so I was kneeling next to his legs and facing him. This is our vacation. Don't ruin it with talk of... He frowned more. Talking about getting married would ruin it? Wow, that game didn't last long. I frowned then too and went to sit back on the couch, but he grabbed my waist and moved me all the way onto his lap so I was straddling him. His dark brown eyes watched mine and I swallowed hard, suddenly wishing someone would knock on the door. Why did this part always make me so nervous? Why did sitting on his lap like this make me want to jump up and run? You look like a scared little rabbit right now, he whispered, looking up into my face. I shrugged and sat back on his knees. I probably would have lost my balance, but he kept his hands on my waist. Tay, I love you more than anything. I smiled and leaned forward a bit. I love you too, Phil, with all my heart. Then I don't understand. Then his eyes opened wide. Oh! Huh? Suddenly, I was lifted into the air and plopped down on the couch, hard enough to make me grunt. He turned, smiling at me. I forgot that part, he chuckled. With everything that happened with us and the way... What in the world was he talking about? Then he baffled me even more by jumping up and heading towards the door. He stopped halfway, trotted back over, and kissed me deeply. Luckily, I was sitting down because I felt my knees go weak. I'm an idiot, he whispered, brushing the back of his hand over my cheek. Then he kissed the tip of my nose. But I'll make it right. Then I sat there and watched him run out of the room. I flopped back on the couch and stared at the half-open door with absolutely no idea what just happened. No sooner had he left than I heard my dad's voice and felt the sudden need to sit up, run my fingers through my hair, and straighten my clothes. Guilt tickled my lips, and I put my fingers to them, remembering that kiss. Settled in, he smiled, walking over to me. That shower is amazing, Dad, I laughed, jumping up to meet him. His smile faded as I stood, and he saw what I was wearing. I looked down at the oversized shirt and frowned. I didn't like feeling so torn inside. It was like this huge rip between my two worlds now, and I wondered if there really was anything that could fix it. Oliver insisted that you take this room for that very reason, he said, lifting his eyes and forcing the smile back on his face. I had informed him how fond you were of standing in a tiny space with water pouring over your head. I giggled and reached out to take his hand. Again his smile fell. You're splint. Dad, please, I frowned. I'll go put it on right now, but stop frowning, please. He blinked and I nodded. I get enough of that from... So, is she all settled in now? We both turned and my jaw fell as Miss Mullender pranced into my room. Seriously? That took some nerve, but it seemed she had plenty of it packed away in that little frame. that nifty little computer thing still propped in one arm. "Oh, did we misplace your night clothes?" she gasped, looking down at me and then moving to the dresser. "I am so sorry, Mr. Blvd. I am absolutely certain that I ordered—" "Stop!" I yelled, as she reached for the handle of the dresser. She gave a small gasp, pulling her hands back as if I had burnt it from across the room. What in the— was she for real? How could she— I was speechless even inside my own head. My dad chuckled, though, and I blinked and looked at him. He winked. "Miss Mullender, my daughter is a bit private about her things." "Oh!" she exclaimed, and trotted over on her mini stilts, her eyes wide and soft like a doe. "Oh, Miss Blvd, I am so sorry." She shook her head and started tapping something on her screen. "I am noting that in the help's chore logs." Then she smiled and winked at my dad. "I never have to be told something twice." My dad smiled and nodded. "She's right, sweetheart. Talk about a memory." He turned to me and then paused. I think my jaw was laying on the floor somewhere. My eyes blinked, I think, but I wasn't even sure about that. The last few seconds were replaying themselves over in my mind. Didn't he see her little game? There was a knock on the open door, and we all turned. Please let it be Track, I thought, and then moaned when Jonathan walked in. I noticed little Miss Perky bounce a bit, though, and I felt my hackles go up. He surveyed all of our faces and then bit back a smile. "Miss Mullender, could you please see to the food order that has just arrived?" He was talking to her, but his eyes were focused on me. She took a second to respond, looking at my dad, who was moving towards the fireplace. "Absolutely," she said, in a less than chipper voice, and I felt like slamming her to the ground and helping her find a different catchphrase. My lips twitched and my fist clenched. She tried to regain her poise, obviously not used to being sent off. How odd for an assistant. "Mr. Hilver, I want to reiterate that since your own assistant isn't here—" Jonathan nodded. "Thank you, Miss Mullender, but I have everything I need." Wow, look at the swirls in the rug. I wonder if they have put them there on purpose. I heard her shoes click as she stepped onto the floor, and I let out a low growl as she left. "You don't have your splint on," Jonathan said, taking a step closer to me. I balked and took a step back. He frowned and looked around. "I took it off in the shower. I just wanted to give it a break, a rest." I winced at my choice of words. He chuckled and nodded. "Well, the doctor's seen to the others, but I'll have him come take a look at it soon." That was Jonathan, a take-charge, matter-of-fact kind of vampire. "So," I said, quickly turning to my dad, "how long are we staying here?" I walked over and sat down on the couch. My dad, who was standing by the fireplace, smiled. "Just as long as we need to." I rolled my eyes and he chuckled, walked over and kissed the top of my head. "You enjoy yourself. You need to remember how to do that." There was a mix of sadness and anger behind his smile when he stood. "Dad, it's not— I did—" I blew out my breath and he chuckled and then left the room. Yikes, what was he doing? I glanced at Jonathan, who had taken his place by the fireplace, and then snapped my head back towards the door in time to see my dad walk through it. The only thing that didn't get him completely kicked off my good list is that he left the door open, all the way. Michael gave me a nod from his chair in the hallway, and I gave him a small smile. "Reina?" I swallowed hard but didn't turn. I knew I had to talk to him, but it's a lot easier when you're prepared for it, and I wasn't. "I love you." My whole body stiffened, my eyes still locked on the door. He couldn't be serious. I know you believe what you're feeling is real, and I won't try to argue with that. His voice was a little closer now. But the truth will come out. What is the truth? I whispered, my voice shaking a bit. That it didn't take some spell to make me fall in love with you, or you to fall in love with me. I whipped my head around, my eyes tight. There is no spell, Jonathan, I snapped. They didn't shoot me with some magic drug, or sprinkle witch powder over me. I rubbed the tips of my fingers together to gesture. You have no idea. Suddenly my anger flinched. Come on, say it. Jonathan nodded, smiling softly, and took a step closer. I put my hand up, squared my shoulders, and shook my head. I love Phil. Wow. There. I said it. It felt good, too. I mean, it didn't feel good to spit it out in Jonathan's face like that, but now it was over. We could move past this. He would pack up and leave. Mad, but I blew the hair out of my face. It was over at least. I'm not leaving. Huh? His gray eyes sparkled as he smiled at me. Reina, when I told you I loved you, I meant it. I have never loved anyone more, and I can never love anyone else. I looked around the room. This isn't how this was supposed to go. I see, he chuckled. Thought I would fly into a rage, then pack up my things and storm back home? I shrugged and flinched when he laughed again. A few seconds passed. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted him to leave. He was supposed to want to leave. I bit my lip and watched the floor in front of him. Then he took a small step towards me. Reina, you have no idea how hard it is to stand here and watch you. His voice shook with emotion. I want to reach out and take you. He stopped when I put my hand up again. My stomach was knotted with guilt now. It wasn't easy hearing the pain in his voice. I did love Phil, and I knew it wasn't some witch-made spell. But I was in love with Jonathan not so long ago. He was a good person, kind and sweet, and I was a monster. I am so sorry for hurting you, I whispered, still not able to look directly at him. My nose tingled. You didn't do anything to deserve it, but I really do. Please don't say it, he whispered quickly, and my heart squeezed the breath out of me. I'm not leaving. I know you completely believe that what you're feeling is real, and it sickens me that they have done this to you. His whisper was shaking now, and I saw his hands clench. I should have yelled at him again, demanded that he leave, but the pain in his voice took my anger away. I will take care of you, even when you don't want me to. He didn't move closer, and he kept his voice low, but it was stronger now. I will always be there for you. I will keep you safe. A tear spilled over and ran down my cheek. How did I deserve him? Why didn't he hate me? It would have been so much easier if he had hated me. I gave you my heart, he whispered again. His words were soft and filled with sadness. I leaned forward, burying my face in my hands. And I won't take it back. It's yours. Forever. My shoulders shook as I cried. Forever. That was the word I engraved in the keychain I gave him when we became an official couple. I remembered sitting there, carefully etching it onto that little metal disc. I remembered the look on his face when he opened it. I had meant it with all my heart. I never wanted to hurt him, never meant to fall so in love with someone else. The pain shot through me, and this time there was no relief. I didn't shift. My mind and heart tortured me by keeping me conscious enough to feel the pain and hurt I had caused him. The guilt stirred the other emotions, and I cried harder. When something touched the top of my hair, I shivered, but didn't look up, too buried in my own shame. When I heard shouting, I paused, my hands still over my face. Someone else yelled, and I sniffled and looked up. Jonathan was gone. I turned and looked over the back of the couch, surprised to see Michaud headed towards me. I put my face back in my hands. I didn't want anyone to look at the monster I was. Then my bodyguard did something he had never done before. He sat down next to me, put his massive hand on my back. I turned, fell into his chest, and cried again. I will kill either or both of them, he growled, putting his large arms around me carefully, as if he might actually break me. Just tell me which one should go first. I smiled through my tears, but stayed against my protector. Tay! I stiffened and then turned my head a bit to see Phil, Track, and Jackson fly through into the room. Michael didn't flinch when they slammed to a halt and looked at us. I sat up more, then wiped at the wet spot I had made on his nice shirt. Sorry, I whispered. Don't be, Michael smiled, standing up. And I meant what I said. He winked at me then, turned and glared at the guys as he walked out, tapping that thing in his ear. Now that is... What happened? Track asked, watching my bodyguard leave and then turning back to me. The three of them came around the couch. Phil sat next to me, Track on the other side, and Jackson squatted in front of me. Nothing, I whispered, lifting up the hem of my shirt and wiping my eyes. Then I looked at the shirt. Sorry. Phil shook his head. What happened? I took a deep breath and shrugged. I told Jonathan. Told him what? Jackson hissed, realizing he had a target now. That I was in love. With you, I whispered, looking into Phil's eyes. So what? Phil shot Jackson a hard stare, and I felt more tears fall. It didn't go so well, I shrugged, looking back down at the tear-soaked shirt. He lifted my chin, his eyes hard and yet soft at the same time. What did he say? Track and Jackson tensed, watching me. I shook my head, and Phil's growl rumbled through us all. I think it's time he and I had a little chat, he hissed. No, please, I begged, reaching out and touching his cheek. No more, please. I can't take any more. The brown eyes watered a bit, and I shook my head. No more fighting. No more anger. I'm so full, I tapped my chest. It feels like it's going to explode. Phil reached out and pulled me into his arms and held me while I cried one more time. Where did the bodies store all of that salty water? My eyes were sore, my chest ached, my throat felt raw, and I slumped against him, feeling like I had run all the way here instead of flown. Pain and guilt could destroy a person. I had heard that in a movie once, but now I understood it. Part of me wanted to lay down somewhere and die, literally and completely die. The weight of all that had happened was so much, I wasn't sure I could carry it anymore. I was tired. So very, very tired. The kind of tired that sucks all the energy from your bones, your mind, and your heart. Somehow, this was all my fault, or at least all because of me. Why? What had I done? Why did everyone else have to suffer for it? Stop hurting everyone else, I thought, a twinge of anger warming me. If you want me, take me, I yelled in my mind, the rage building like a storm. Leave them alone and just take me. At some point, exhaustion took me up on the offer. I fell asleep wrapped in Phil's arms, on the couch, in a man's house I had never met, surrounded by people I loved, that no longer even liked each other, all because of me. My dreams were odd and patched together. Memories and fears stitched themselves into bizarre scenes that floated through my mind. Even there, I was too tired to react. My heart was worn, my soul was exhausted, and my body felt beaten. Just then, something tugged at my mind, and the buzzing started in my ears. No, I moaned, swatting the air. I just want to sleep, I whispered, wrinkling my nose as the buzzing got louder. I want her kept out of their sight, I heard a voice say, and I nodded, feeling my nose tingle. They were right. I should be kept out of everyone's sight. It was better that way. No trouble, is that clear? I frowned, but nodded. I'll be good, I promise, I whispered to the voice, rolling over to hug the cloud that was now under me. The doctor is on his way in. Doctor? I sat up quickly and blinked my eyes, thoughts of giant needles in my mind. Phil leaned over and smiled at me. He just needs to check your arm. I blinked again and looked around, realizing I was now on the large bed. My dad smiled at me as he approached. We thought it might be easier if he checked on you while you were asleep. My brows wrinkled, and then I glanced at my arm that was now back in the splint. We didn't want you re-injuring it while you slept, my wolf smiled, sitting on the edge of the bed. Oh, I replied quietly, still trying to pull myself out of the odd place I had been. My dad knelt and watched me. His eyes looked tired, too. Sweetheart, there's going to be a council session here. Here? He nodded. Some have already started to arrive. When I frowned, he shook his head. You are to stay here, away from the meetings. Did he think I would argue about that? His smile said he knew what I was thinking. I despised those meetings and avoided most of the members. Arrogant, uppity vampires. Except for my dad, that is. When he stood, I followed him with my eyes. Then his words sunk in a bit more. Wait, in here? In this room? Not entirely, he smiled, leaning over and kissing the top of my head. But I want them to stay away from you. I don't want you talking to any of them either. Okay, that was weird. First of all, I usually avoided them as if they had the plague. And secondly, what would I have to talk to them about? I made small talk with them when I had to put in an appearance as the daughter of the head of the council. Some were relatives, but even they were only a little less annoying. In this meeting, to talk about... When he nodded, I frowned and looked down. Great. Now the entire council was shifting their lives because of... My head tilted. Because of a vampire that loved a werewolf? My eyes tightened. Dad, I don't understand. He nodded. I know. I don't completely understand either, but that is why we're here. Suddenly, I had questions, and lots of them. What about the people that chased us? In the cars? I sat up more and looked, and the look on his face told me he wished I was still sleeping. My dad was like Jonathan and my pack that way. They didn't just keep me in the dark. They went to extreme efforts to keep me from even noticing I was in the dark. For the most part, I loved them for that. They did it because they cared. But I wanted some answers. They have been dealt with, he replied with an edge to his voice that made my eyes widen. Dealt with? He smiled and shook his head. I have to go now, sweetheart. Michael knows what areas are safe for you to explore. I want you to explore. Have some fun. Swim in that very amazing, very expensive pool, he chuckled. They even have a kitchen. Oh? I asked. I love to cook. Yeah, I know. Vampires don't eat, so why would we cook? I looked around the room and saw Trax standing near the end of the bed. I cooked for my best friend and my pack mates. What started as a curiosity had turned into a full-blown kitchen back home. I smiled as a few happy memories pushed out some of the others. I know that look, my best friend smiled. Pies or cookies? I went to reply and then shook myself and turned back to my dad. Nice try. He shrugged and I moved to the edge of the bed, so I was sitting next to Phil. Dad, why were they chasing us? And why were they trying to kill us? I winced at that. They had succeeded in taking 2 of our very dear friends. I don't think they were, he stated calmly. Huh? Which one? I don't believe they were trying to kill you. I noticed a slight emphasis on the last word, and I swallowed hard. They were trying to kill the guys? I gasped. My dad stepped up to me, leaned over, and kissed my cheek. You and I will have a talk later. When I frowned, he stroked it. I know you want answers, sweetheart, and I actually agree with you. My brows lifted then. He nodded and stood. But right now, I don't have them, and I'm not going to sit and dump questions on top of yours. I told you I would fix this, and I will. When I have some solid answers, I will talk to you. He smiled and winked. Until then, relax and stay away from all the council members. I shrugged, hiding my smile. Aren't you on the council? I loved it when my dad laughed. Indeed I am. I shrugged again and he nodded. Well then, let me rephrase that. Keep away from any and all council members that weren't on the plane that brought us here. When I giggled, he winked and turned, nodding to Michael, who followed him as far as the door. My bodyguard gave me a nod as he shut the door behind him. There was a comfort knowing he was right outside. I had missed him too. So, since you're grounded, Trax sighed, flopping on the bed next to me. I'm not grounded, I huffed. At least I didn't think I was. Now I was wondering just who was being kept away from who. There was a knock on the door, and then Ryan poked his head in. I smiled as our alpha walked over, and he returned the gesture. So, I wanted to come in and make sure you all understood the rules. Even though he said all, his eyes moved from me to Track and finally to Phil. What did that mean? Track shrugged. No worries, boss. We got it covered. Ryan shook his head and then looked at me. How are you holding up? Now that was a loaded question. I could have dumped all my questions on him, but I had a feeling that wasn't what he was asking. Plus, he was as bad as the rest of them when it came to hiding information from me. So I replied with a plain old, not bad. Where's Jay? In with Rock and Cal, Phil stated, standing up. My 2 alphas. I winced a bit. That was odd. Ryan was the pack alpha, over the entire Polson pack. Phil was our clique alpha and in charge of a smaller section of wolves, all our age. I looked at them both, not really hearing what they were saying to each other. Phil was so strong, in form, but also mentally. He was a leader. That made me smile. Track reached over and poked my arm. Doc is on his way in, little Miss Pincushion. I groaned, and Ryan nodded. You will let him look at that arm. I hear you keep taking that splint off. It itches, I mumbled, looking down and feeling like a child. I'll check with the doc about that, Phil put in, and I was both grateful and embarrassed at the same time. Ryan nodded, leaned over and kissed the top of my head, shot Track one more warning look, and went to leave. Are you going to the meeting too? I asked, suddenly curious. The parts they'll let me in on. I gasped and my eyes widened. A werewolf in a vampire council meeting? It was like hearing that a fish sprouted legs and was the CEO of a company. Those things just didn't happen. Period. His smile dipped a little and he shrugged. We're having some side meetings, he stated, and I think I had insulted him without realizing it. I hadn't meant to. In fact, I was impressed. I just meant, you watch out, Ryan. They are bloodsuckers, Track added, and I smacked his arm. I'll keep that in mind, our alpha chuckled, and then left the room. Right as I turned to land another punch, I heard another voice outside. Someone growled, and I balked when I realized it was coming from me. Down, she-wolf, Track chuckled. Remember, no getting in trouble. What fun would that be? I whispered, smiling. Which is exactly why I'm here, Phil chuckled, then looked at me. Well, one of the reasons. Track moaned and shook his head. You two get all mushy-faced with me sitting right here, and I will... He looked around and I crossed my arms. I will... He jumped up and pointed towards the door. I will let her in. I rolled my eyes. Go ahead. Huh? I shrugged. Go ahead, she doesn't bother me. This time both he and Phil laughed. Okay, so it was childish, but I took it as a dare. When I stood up and headed towards the door, they both jumped up and blocked me. Track was just messing with you, Phil stated, but I liked the little sparkle I saw in his eyes. No, Okay, I was, Track shrugged when I looked at him. I don't have a problem with her, I stated, trying to keep the grit from my jaw. Truth was, she rubbed me the wrong way bad, but I didn't like that they seemed to find that humorous. Why can't I see my own cousin? We all froze then. I've been worried sick about her, came the female's voice from the other side of the door. Please, I've missed her so much. The voice shook with emotion that we all knew was fake. You can't be serious, Track gasped. I could only stare at the door in shock. And that's where I'm going to stop.